One other element that might be confusing to you, because I know it was confusing to me, is what exactly are these def objects? Why do we have to create a shape def in order to create a shape? Can we access these definitions later? Do we need to change them if we want to alter the shape? How does all of that work? So probably the best way to answer the question of for example, what is a B2 polygon def is really just think of it as a simpler way to pass parameters. And that's really it. So if we didn't have these B2 polygon def objects, our function for creating a shape might look a little something like this. We'd have a whole bunch of parameters that we want to pass in with a whole bunch of default values. I'm not even sure this can work because I'm creating an object as a default value, which I don't think you're allowed to do in ActionScript. But as you can see, this is kind of a mess. And even with something like Flash Develop to help you enter all the parameters right, it is still kind of messy. And so basically what they did is they said, hey, let's take all of these parameters that you might want to pass, the type, the friction, the restitution, etc., and we will just combine all of that into some object. This object's really just going to have a whole bunch of public variables that you can kind of set, and that's kind of about it. And that's how you get this much simpler, much nicer looking function. I guess we do get some extra functionality with turning it into a def object. We're able to, for example, use the set as box function so that we can create the vertices without having to do them by hand. So we get a little extra functionality there, but really it's just a simple way to pass a whole bunch of parameters. As far as I can tell, they do not get stored with the shape. Once you've used it to create the shape, it's done. That's all she wrote. You can then go back and modify or change this polygon def so that you can use it to create other shapes, and that won't change any of the shapes you've already created. So if, for example, you wanted to change the friction of an object after you've created it, and you tried to do so by changing its polygon def object, that wouldn't have any effect because the object's already been created, it's already got its friction value set. You'd have to go into the object itself and change the friction value. One question that you may or may not have is, why didn't I use set as oriented box when I created my crate that I wanted tilted at 30 degrees? So for example, when I created my falling crate, first I set it as a box, and then later I took the body definition and I set the angle to something like 30 degrees. Now you may have noticed when you were typing in this set as box function that Flash Develop gave you as an alternative function this thing called set as oriented box that takes the half width, the half height, and an angle. And you might think, boy, I should just do that and that would create my box in one statement instead of two, and wow, I've simplified my code by 50%. The reason you wouldn't want to do that is because it actually kind of makes things confusing. So if in this first example, if I create a box, I get an original box that looks like this. If I then set the angle of it to something like 30 degrees, it would look a little something like this. And if I tilted it by another 15 degrees to make it 45 degrees total, I'd get something that looks like this. All right, that's all fine and dandy. Now if I create my oriented box, what I'm basically doing is I'm creating a shape that looks like an oriented box. It looks like something, for instance, that is tilted 30 degrees. However, this box that is tilted 30 degrees is actually tilted 0 degrees. It is a tilted box that right now is tilted at 0 degrees. And if suddenly I wanted it to look like it was tilted 45 degrees, I would take this 30 degrees box and actually tilt it 15 degrees. Are you confused? Well, good, because I am too. And that's why I don't like using set as oriented box. Really, the situation where you would use this set as oriented box function is if, for example, you wanted to create the letter W in box 2D. You could use multiple shapes that were oriented boxes to create the slants of the W, combine it all into one body that would then be the letter W. If you're doing it just to create a crate that looks like it's tilted, don't use this function. Use the normal set as box and then tilt the body. It'll be a whole lot easier for you. Finally, the last question we have is, why do we set the shapes around 0, 0 and then go through the trouble of moving them? For example, let's look at the floor that we created. Remember that very first floor we created by creating the vertices? We did it by creating a rectangle that went from 0, 0 to 550, 10. Basically, we had a long skinny box that was 550 pixels wide, 10 pixels high, but it was created at 0, 0, and then we had to go through the trouble of then setting the position of that object down to 0, 390 so that it went from being at the top of our Flash movie to the bottom. Now, couldn't you have done something like this? Instead of having to set it from 0, 0 to 550, 10, we just set it from 0, 390 to 550, 400, and then all of a sudden our shape is located in the right position. And then we can just keep its position at 0, 0. And I think this is a bad idea. And the two reasons I think it's a bad idea is, one, Box2D likes things better the first way. I don't know exactly what happens if you create all of these objects that have shapes that seem to put them in different locations, but all have a position at 0, 0. Does Box2D spend extra time thinking maybe they've collided because their positions look the same? To be honest, I don't really know. Maybe it's smart enough to know not to do that, but it just strikes me as kind of a bad idea. And so I'd probably just recommend going with that first approach, because I have a hunch Box2D likes things a whole lot better that way. The other reason to go with the first approach is it'll just be more consistent with the way Box2D creates its own boxes and circles. If you were to create a circle in Box2D, it would do it by creating the circle shape around 0, 0, and then you would set the position of that circle to wherever you want it on the screen. If you kind of do that approach with your circles and your boxes, but then do a completely different approach with any polygons you create on your own, you're going to have two different sets of coordinates, and it's just going to get really confusing. So in general, I would say strive to kind of do things the way Box2D does. When you create their shapes, define them either with 0, 0 as their center or 0, 0 as somewhere close to the center, and then set the position accordingly.